Now, this was a long module with a lot of key concepts. In general, this module was about how Next.js pre-renders pages for us, so that if we view the page source, we have some data in that page source, some data which is there right from the start and which is therefore also visible to search engine crawlers, which is a key difference to standard React apps without server-side rendering. Now, you did learn that out of the box, Next.js pre-renders your pages. It does that automatically. But you can also force it to do so by adding getStaticProps, because you add this function whenever you also want to prefetch data for your component. So if your page component doesn't need any data, of course you never add getStaticProps typically, because it doesn't add anything to the page then. But if your page does need data, like the list of products here, then you add getStaticProps so that during the build process, this data is prefetched and available for the page when it's pre-rendered, so that the pre-rendered page contains prefetched data. Now, since getStaticProps executes during the build process, you can execute Node.js code in there, which wouldn't run in the browser. For example, you can get access to the file system and read data from files. Now, since data can get outdated after the pages were pre-generated, you can also add the revalidate key here in the object you return from inside getStaticProps to tell Next.js that this page should be regenerated again and again even after the page was built and deployed, at most every X seconds, here at most once every 10 seconds. Therefore, getStaticProps is great for ensuring that you are pre-rendering pages with data. Now, if you have dynamic pages with a dynamic parameter, then you also need to let Next.js know how many instances of that page should be pre-rendered, because it could be an infinite amount in theory. You do that with getStaticPaths, and you need to add this when using getStaticProps on such a dynamic page. Otherwise, you'll get an error because Next.js doesn't know how many pages to prepare. GetStaticPaths returns an object with a paths key, which holds an array of param objects in the end, where you basically just make Next.js aware of all the parameter values for this dynamic page that should be used for pre-rendering a page. And you can also reach out to a file system or database or whatever you need to do here. And when you do that, Next.js will pre-generate all the paths, so all the instances of that page for the paths you tell it to pre-render. It will then call getStaticProps for every page instance that it creates. You can access the params there, as you learned, and then you can fetch and prepare the data there just as it's needed, return that to the component function, and then last but not least, Next.js will execute this component function in the build process or on the server to pre-render this page as well with the appropriate data. Now, sometimes you don't want to pre-build during the build process, and even when using revalidate, the data might not be updated enough. Instead, you really might want to run logic for every incoming request, either because you need access to the request or because the data changes all the time. In such cases, you can use getServerSideProps. It's an alternative, and unlike getStaticProps, this really runs on the server and only on the server, not during the build process. Here, you can get access to the request and response objects, to the real node request and response objects, and you still return props to the component, which is then pre-rendered, but pre-rendered on the fly on the server. You can also do that for dynamic pages, and here you don't need getStaticPaths because this now really does only execute when it's needed, not in advance. However, sometimes that's also not what you're looking for. Sometimes you really need to fetch data from inside the client, or you want to combine pre-rendering with client-side data fetching. And that's what we saw in the last lectures. You can also still write regular React code, regular React JavaScript code for fetching data in your component function. And this code will then not be executed on the server, even though the page will still be pre-rendered, but this code will be skipped since it's inside of useEffect typically. Instead, you'll just get some snapshot of your page, which is then returned, and that code really only runs in the client, so when a visitor visits the page. Here, you can also consider using the use SWR hook, since that can make writing that code a bit easier, and since that is a feature-rich custom hook built by the Next.js team, which, for example, also automatically refetches data if you lose and regain focus in your browser tab. So that can also be nice. And as you saw, you can even still combine that with preparing and prefetching data. And therefore, this was a long module, but data fetching and pre-rendering of pages with prefetched data is another key aspect of Next.js. The file-based routing was nice and already a great feature, but this here, prefetching and pre-rendering, that's the feature which really makes Next.js super powerful. Because now it's easy to optimize pages for search engines, it's easy to show users some data right from the start, and you can still apply everything you know about React. And therefore, let's now apply what we learned here to our demo project in the next section before we then dig deeper into Next again.